The locomotive sat in the maintenance shed, silent and still. But the workers refused to go near it. They called it the Widowmaker, and for good reason. Between 1903 and 1906, this single class of steam locomotive would kill 40 railroad engineers. Not in accidents, not in derailments, but from a design flaw so catastrophic, so fundamentally deadly, that every man who climbed into the cab knew he might not come home alive. The railroad knew about the problem. The engineers knew about the problem. But for 3 years, they kept running these locomotives anyway. This is the story of the Great Western Railway's 3400 class, the most dangerous steam engine ever built in Britain, and the fatal flaw that turned routine operations into a death sentence. Welcome to Iron Chronicles. I'm your host, and today we're investigating one of the darkest chapters in railroad safety history, a time when corporate profits mattered more than human lives. A time when engineers climbed into locomotive cabs knowing they were playing Russian roulette with steam, fire, and metal. The 3400 class locomotives weren't sabotaged. They weren't poorly maintained. They were designed wrong from the very beginning, and that design killed dozens of men before anyone had the courage to stop it. Let's begin. To understand how the Widowmaker came to be, we need to go back to turn-of-century Britain. The year was 1903, and the Great Western Railway was in the middle of a massive expansion. The GWR, as it was known, was one of Britain's big four railway companies. It operated thousands of miles of track across England and Wales, moving both passengers and freight. And by 1903, it desperately needed more powerful locomotives. The man tasked with designing these new engines was George Jackson Churchward, the GWR's chief mechanical engineer. Churchward was brilliant, innovative, and ambitious. He had already revolutionized British locomotive design with his earlier engines. But he was about to make a mistake that would cost dozens of men their lives. Churchward's brief was simple: design a powerful freight locomotive that could haul heavy coal trains up the steep gradients of South Wales. These routes were brutal. Grades of 1 in 52 were common. That means for every 52 feet traveled, the train climbed 1 foot in elevation. Doesn't sound like much, but with a 1,000-ton coal train behind you, it was punishing work. The locomotives needed enormous power, and power, in the steam age, came from one thing: boiler pressure. Here's where we need to understand some basic steam locomotive physics. A steam locomotive works by heating water in a massive boiler until it turns to steam. That steam is then directed into cylinders where it pushes pistons back and forth. Those pistons are connected to the wheels, and that's how the locomotive moves. The hotter you make the steam, the higher the pressure, and the higher the pressure, the more power you get. It's simple thermodynamics. Churchward decided his new locomotives would run at 200 pounds per square inch of boiler pressure. This was extremely high for 1903. Most locomotives of that era ran at 150 to 175 psi, but Churchward was convinced that higher pressure meant better performance. He was right about the performance, but he overlooked something catastrophic. The design he settled on was called the 3400 class. It was a 2-6-0 configuration, meaning it had 2 small leading wheels, 6 large driving wheels, and no trailing wheels. The boiler was massive, over 16 feet long and 5 feet in diameter. It could hold 3,500 gallons of water. But here's the fatal flaw, and it's so obvious in hindsight that it's almost unbelievable no one caught it. Churchward positioned the firebox, the hottest part of the locomotive where coal was burned, directly beneath and slightly behind the engineer's position in the cab. This wasn't unusual by itself. Many locomotives had this configuration. But the 3400 class had a specific design element that made it a death trap. The copper firebox crown sheet, the flat metal ceiling inside the firebox that separated the fire from the water above it, was barely covered by water. We're talking about just 3 inches of water above this crown sheet in some areas. Now here's what you need to understand. That crown sheet was being heated to extreme temperatures by the coal fire below. The only thing preventing it from melting was the water above it, which absorbed the heat and turned to steam. If the water level dropped even slightly, If it fell below the crown sheet, that copper would be exposed directly to flames exceeding 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit. Copper melts at 1984 degrees Fahrenheit. What happens when a boiler full of water at 200 psi suddenly has a hole melted through its crown sheet? The instant water flashes to steam, all 3,500 gallons of it in less than 1 second. This is called a boiler explosion, and it's one of the most violent industrial events in history. The expanding steam creates a shockwave equivalent to several tons of dynamite. The boiler literally tears itself apart, sending shrapnel in every direction at hundreds of miles per hour. The engineer, sitting just a few feet away, never had a chance. This design flaw, the shallow water coverage over an extremely hot crown sheet at very high pressure, was a ticking bomb built into every single 3400 class locomotive, and Great Western Railway ordered 40 of them. The first 3400 class locomotive, number 3400 itself, was completed at the GWR's Swindon Works in February 1903. It was a beautiful machine. The boiler was painted Brunswick green with polished brass fittings. The driving wheels stood 5 feet 8 inches tall. It looked powerful, modern, and safe. Initial trials went well. The locomotive performed exactly as Churchward had hoped. It could haul massive loads up steep grades. It was fast for a freight engine. The crews who tested it were impressed. But they also noticed something troubling. The water level in the boiler was incredibly sensitive. It would drop faster than on any locomotive that operated before. The engineer had to constantly monitor the water gauge and keep the injectors running to maintain proper levels. This should have been a red flag, but everyone assumed the crews just needed to adjust to the new design. By June 1903, 10 3400 class locomotives were in regular service on the South Wales coal routes. And that's when the killing began. On June 14, 1903, locomotive number 3403 was pulling a coal train from Pontypool Road to Gloucester. The engineer was a 42-year-old man named Thomas Richards. He'd worked for the GWR for 18 years. He was experienced, careful, and well-respected. At approximately 2:30 p.m., as the locomotive was climbing a steep grade near Grange Court, something went wrong. Witnesses reported hearing a sound like thunder, followed by a massive explosion. The boiler of number 3403 had exploded. When rescue crews reached the scene, they found the locomotive completely destroyed. The boiler had split open like a can opener had gone through it. The cab was simply gone, blown to pieces. Metal fragments were scattered across a 200-foot radius. Thomas Richards was found 40 feet from the locomotive. He'd been killed instantly by the blast. The force had been so violent that investigators couldn't determine exactly what had killed him: the shrapnel, the steam, or the impact of being thrown through the air. The fireman, who'd been standing slightly further back in the cab, survived, but was horribly scalded by steam. He'd spend 6 months in hospital and never work on a locomotive again. The official investigation concluded that the boiler explosion was caused by low water in the firebox crown sheet. In other words, the water level had dropped, exposing the crown sheet to direct flame, and the metal had failed. But here's what's important. The investigators blamed the engineer. The official report stated that Thomas Richards had failed to maintain proper water levels and that the explosion was the result of operator error. This conclusion would have devastating consequences because it meant the GWR didn't have to redesign the locomotives. It wasn't a design flaw. It was just a careless engineer. Except it wasn't. 3 months later, on September 9, 1903, locomotive number 3406 exploded at Pontypool Road locomotive shed. The engineer, 38-year-old David Morgan, was killed instantly. The fireman lost both legs. Same cause, low water over the crown sheet. Same official conclusion, operator error. 2 months after that, on November 22, 1903, number 3401 exploded near Severn Tunnel Junction. Engineer killed, fireman critically injured. Low water, operator error. By the end of 1903, 5 3400 class locomotives had suffered catastrophic boiler explosions. 7 engineers were dead. Multiple firemen were permanently disabled. And the Great Western Railway's official position remained unchanged. These were isolated incidents caused by careless operation. But the men who actually worked these locomotives knew better. They started calling the 3400 class the Widowmaker. Engineers would request transfers rather than operate them. Some men quit the railway entirely. The problem was obvious to anyone who spent time in the cab. The water level was almost impossible to maintain on steep grades. When the locomotive was climbing, the water in the boiler shifted backward, away from the crown sheet. The steam demand was highest during climbs, which meant water was being converted to steam at maximum rate. Even the most careful engineer, watching the water gauge constantly, could see the level drop below safe limits in a matter of seconds. And once it dropped below the crown sheet, you had maybe 30 seconds before the copper began to fail. Maybe. The engineers developed desperate strategies to survive. Some would deliberately let the locomotive stall on grades rather than push it hard enough to drop the water level. Others would dump cold water into the boiler at dangerous rates, risking thermal shock just to keep the crown sheet covered. But no strategy was foolproof, because the fundamental design was flawed. By early 1904, the situation with the 3400 class had become a crisis. But it was a quiet crisis, one the Great Western Railway desperately wanted to keep quiet. George Churchward was under enormous pressure. He'd designed these locomotives. His reputation was on the line. Admitting they had a fundamental design flaw would be professional suicide. They would also cost the railway millions of pounds to redesign and rebuild 40 locomotives. So instead, the GWR doubled down on blaming the engineers. They issued new operating procedures for the 3400 class. Engineers were required to check water levels every 3 minutes. They had to maintain minimum speeds on grades to prevent water surge. They were forbidden from opening the throttle beyond 75% on climbs. These rules were almost impossible to follow in practice. Checking water levels every 3 minutes meant the engineer couldn't watch the track ahead. Maintaining minimum speeds on steep grades with heavy loads meant the locomotives often couldn't make it up the hill, and limiting throttle meant the whole point of these powerful engines was negated. But the rules served a purpose. They gave the GWR legal cover. If an engineer died, the railway could point to the rules and say, "See, he didn't follow procedure. It's his fault." The Engineers Union, the Associated Society of Locomotive Engineers and Firemen, began pushing back. They demanded safety modifications to the 3400 class. They wanted better water gauges, automatic water level alarms, and a redesign of the firebox to increase water coverage over the crown sheet. The GWR refused. Too expensive, not necessary, just follow the procedures. Meanwhile, the explosions continued. 1904 saw 8 more catastrophic failures, 12 engineers dead, countless firemen injured, many permanently disabled. 1905, 7 explosions, 10 engineers killed, and still the official position never changed. Operator error, failure to maintain water levels, careless operation. But behind closed doors, Churchward knew the truth. He'd quietly begun working on modifications. The problem was he couldn't implement them without admitting the original design was flawed. There's a heartbreaking document in the GWR archives. It's a letter from Churchward to the railway's board of directors dated March 1905. In it, he proposes several design changes to improve operational safety of the 3400 class. He wanted to increase the water space above the crown sheet from 3 inches to 6 inches. He wanted to install multiple redundant water gauges. He wanted to add fusible plugs to the crown sheet. These were safety devices that would melt at high temperature and release steam before a catastrophic explosion could occur. All of these modifications would have saved lives. The board rejected them. Too expensive, would require taking locomotives out of service for modifications, would create operational disruptions. In other words, profit mattered more than lives. So the killing continued. Here's what makes this even tragic. By 1905, other railways had heard about the problems with the 3400 class. The London and North Western Railway, the Midland Railway, the Lancashire and Yorkshire Railway, they all quietly added safety features to their own high-pressure locomotive designs specifically to avoid the flaws in the 3400 class. The Great Western Railway was literally the only major company in Britain still running locomotives with this dangerous configuration, and everyone knew it. The incident that finally forced change happened on August 17, 1906, at Pontypool Road Locomotive Shed. It was a routine day. Locomotive number 3418 had just finished a coal run from the valleys. It was sitting in the shed, fire-banked low, waiting for its next assignment. The engineer, a 51-year-old man named William Griffiths, was in the cab doing routine checks. William Griffiths was everything the GWR claimed their engineers should be. He'd worked for the railway for 28 years. He had a perfect safety record. He followed every procedure to the letter. He was known for being almost obsessively careful about water levels. At 3:47 p.m., number 3418 exploded. The blast was so violent it was heard 5 miles away. The locomotive shed's roof was blown completely off. Windows shattered in buildings 300 yards away. The boiler separated from the frame and was thrown 80 feet through the air, crashing through the side of another building. William Griffiths was killed instantly, but he wasn't alone. The shed was full of other workers, mechanics, cleaners, apprentices. The explosion sent shrapnel in every direction. When the smoke cleared, 6 men were dead. 14 were injured, several critically. This wasn't an isolated incident on a remote stretch of track anymore. This was a massacre in the heart of a major railway facility. And this time, there were too many witnesses to blame operator error. The mechanics who'd been working nearby testified that Griffiths had checked the water level just 5 minutes before the explosion. It had been normal. There was no reason for the crown sheet to be exposed. The investigation revealed something Churchward had suspected but never publicly acknowledged. The water gauges on the 3400 class were unreliable. They could show adequate water levels even when the crown sheet was partially exposed. This was due to the specific geometry of the boiler and the position of the gauge glasses. In other words, an engineer could be doing everything right, watching his gauges carefully, and still have no idea he was seconds from a catastrophic explosion. The public inquiry into the Pontypool Road disaster was damning. The chief inspector of railways stated in his report, "The design of the 3400 class locomotives is fundamentally unsafe. The margin of error for water level maintenance is insufficient for operational realities. No amount of careful operation can fully mitigate this design flaw." This was the first time a government official had stated in writing what everyone already knew. The locomotives themselves were killers. The press seized on the story. The Times ran a headline, "Railway Profits Built on Coffins." Other newspapers published lists of the dead engineers, calling them martyrs to corporate greed. The political pressure became unbearable. Members of Parliament began asking questions. The Board of Trade launched a formal investigation. Labor unions threatened strikes. Finally, in September 1906, the Great Western Railway announced that all 3400 class locomotives would be immediately withdrawn from service for comprehensive safety modifications. It had taken 3 years, 40 dead engineers, dozens of injured firemen, multiple public disasters. But finally, the killing would stop. The modifications to the 3400 class locomotives were extensive, and they proved, beyond any doubt, that the original design had been fatally flawed all along. Every locomotive was taken to Swindon Works and essentially rebuilt. The firebox was redesigned to increase water coverage over the crown sheet from 3 inches to 7 inches. Multiple redundant water gauges were installed, using different measurement principles so they couldn't all fail the same way. Fusible plugs were added to the crown sheet. These would melt and release steam long before an explosion could occur, giving the crew warning and preventing catastrophic failure. The boiler pressure was reduced from 200 psi to 180 psi. The injectors were upgraded to deliver water faster. Automatic low water alarms were installed. These modifications took nearly 2 years to complete across all 40 locomotives. The cost was astronomical, nearly £500,000 in 1906 money, equivalent to about £65 million today. And here's the thing that makes this entire tragedy even more infuriating. After the modifications, the 3400 class locomotives went on to have long, safe careers. They operated for another 30 years without a single boiler explosion. The modified design worked perfectly. Which means all those deaths, 40 engineers, dozens of injured men, countless widows and orphans, were completely preventable. George Churchward never publicly admitted fault. In his later writings and speeches, he referred to the 3400 class as having initial teething troubles that were resolved through operational experience. teething troubles. That's what he called 40 dead men. But privately, those who knew him said the deaths haunted him. He became obsessed with boiler safety in his later designs. Every locomotive he designed after 1906 had multiple redundant safety systems, generous water coverage over crown sheets, and conservative pressure ratings. Some historians argue that Churchward's later brilliance as a locomotive designer, he went on to create some of Britain's finest steam engines, was driven by guilt over the 3400 class. He spent the rest of his career trying to atone for those deaths. Whether that's true or not, we'll never know. Churchward died in 1933, struck by a train crossing tracks near Swindon. Some who knew him wondered if it was deliberate, a final act of penance. The impact of the 3400 class disaster extended far beyond the Great Western Railway. It led to sweeping changes in British railway safety regulations. The 1907 Railway Safety Act mandated that all new locomotive designs had to be approved by government inspectors before entering service. Boiler designs had to meet minimum safety standards. Water level gauges had to be tested and certified. Fusible plugs became mandatory on all high-pressure locomotives. Labor unions gained new power to refuse to operate equipment they deemed unsafe. Engineers could no longer be blamed for design flaws beyond their control. These regulations saved countless lives over the following decades, but they came too late for the 40 men who died in the 3400 class. Let's talk about what 40 dead engineers actually means, because it's easy to treat this as just a historical statistic, but these were real men with real families. Thomas Richards, the first to die, left behind a wife and 3 children. His youngest daughter was only 4 years old when he was killed. The GWR paid his widow a pension of £50 per year. That's equivalent to about £6,500 today, barely enough to survive. David Morgan, killed in the second explosion, was supporting his elderly parents as well as his own family. When he died, his parents ended up in the workhouse, essentially a Victorian-era homeless shelter. William Griffiths, killed in the Pontypool Road disaster, had 2 sons who were training to become engineers themselves. After their father's death, they both quit the railway and became coal miners instead. They'd rather work underground in dangerous mines than risk the same fate as their father. Most of the 40 engineers killed were men in their 30s and 40s, prime working age, men with families depending on them, men who'd spent years, sometimes decades, learning their trade. The psychological impact on the surviving engineers was severe. Many developed what we'd now recognize as PTSD. They'd have nightmares about boiler explosions. They'd panic when water levels dropped even slightly. Some became so obsessed with watching the water gauge that they'd crash into other trains because they weren't watching the track. There are records of engineers who simply walked away from locomotives mid-shift, unable to overcome the terror of climbing into the cab of a 3400 class engine. The firemen suffered too. Many were permanently disabled by steam scalding. In the days before modern burn treatment, severe steam burns were often more devastating than the immediate explosion. Men would survive the blast only to spend months in agony, their skin sloughing off, infections setting in, ultimately dying slow, painful deaths. The GWR's official compensation for injured workers was minimal. If you survived with disabilities, you might get a small pension, maybe £30 a year if you were lucky. If you could still work in some capacity, you got nothing. Widows received a one-time payment of £100 and a small annual pension that would be cut off if they remarried. Many were forced into poverty. Some had to give up their children to orphanages because they couldn't afford to feed them. This was the true cost of the 3400 class. Not just the engineering failure, not just the corporate cover-up, but the human suffering that rippled out from every explosion, destroying families and communities. The modified 3400 class locomotives operated successfully until the late 1930s. As steam gave way to diesel, they were gradually retired and scrapped. By 1940, all 40 had been cut up for metal. Today, not a single example survives. There are no 3400 class locomotives in museums, no preserved examples running on heritage railways. They were all destroyed. Some historians think this was deliberate, that the Great Western Railway wanted to erase the evidence of their deadliest mistake. Whether that's true or just conspiracy theory, we'll never know. What we do know is that the 3400 class taught the railway industry a lesson written in blood. You cannot cut corners on safety, you cannot prioritize profit over human life, and you cannot blame workers for design flaws beyond their control. These lessons seem obvious now, but they weren't obvious in 1903. It took 40 dead men to make them clear. The Widowmaker earned its name the hard way. Every one of those 40 engineers left behind a widow. Every one of those families was destroyed by a flaw that could have been prevented, should have been prevented, but wasn't, because fixing it would have cost money. Today, locomotive boiler explosions are virtually unheard of. Modern safety systems, regulations written in response to disasters like the 3400 class, and a fundamental change in how we value worker safety have made them a relic of history. But we should never forget the price that was paid to learn these lessons. Thank you for watching Iron Chronicles. If this story moved you, please like and subscribe. We'll continue bringing you the untold stories of railway history, the triumphs, the disasters, and the human cost of progress. Until next time, remember, every safety regulation you see today was written in someone's blood.